Hello, this is an introduction to the 20th century. I'll try to highlight the most important background as far as history, science, and literature are concerned. At the end of this presentation, answer to the following questions. First of all, understand the social condition of Great Britain at the beginning of the new century. In literature, what happened from the late Victorianism to the new movement called modernism, widespread feeling of anxiety or doubt. What were the influences that conditioned the development of the new form of novel? When we talk about the aim, the goal of modernism, in particular, what were three major characteristics of modernist literature? What are two important influences that characterize modernism, and something more specific about writing novels in this period in some writers is the stream of consciousness and the so-called interior monologue. Let's start with the first 14 years before the First World War. After a long reign, Queen Victoria died in 1901. There was a new king, Edward VII, and then George V. And there was the beginning of economical crisis in Great Britain. If you remember the last period, the previous period, in Great Britain was the empire, the British Empire was the leading economic country in the world. But now, because of competition, it is no longer that. There were other problems. There was the problem of the protest of women who wanted to have the right to vote. Don't forget that the first country that gave women the right to vote was Great Britain. So here it is the first sign of this movement for equal opportunities. In Ireland, there was a problem that developed later on in the years with the protest against the British control of the country. Workers, through their trade unions, were protesting. There was unrest. There were riots. They wanted to have better condition, and also the empire, the so-called British Commonwealth, began to have some problems in controlling the colonies. As far as the economy is concerned, there were new markets. They were challenging the position of Great Britain in the world. Let's talk about literature. In the past, especially if you think of Dickens, for example, was very important in his novels the plot, what happens in the story, and how characters interact with society. If you remember, in that period, during the Victorian age, writers had to write something useful for society. But it's like a pendulum. If you remember, during Romanticism, the interest was not on society, but it was on the individual. And now, again, after a movement towards society, now there's another movement towards the individual. After the First World War, there was a sense of anxiety. People didn't know. They didn't have fixed points to refer to. All the previous ideas were fixed in their minds as something determinable, something to refer to, collapsed, were not useful any longer. And because of the possibility of more and more people to attend school, and so the presence of more educated people in the country, as they enjoy reading stories, they wanted something more than the traditional literary forms. They wanted to do something more contemporary. There were many influences. Who published several influential works on the so-called unconscious, how the unconscious controls our lives. There were some modern writers like Dostoevsky and Proust who developed a new style in the writing novels. And in the presence of the new media like radio and film's influence. As you know, a story in a film is not told in the same way as a novel. Also in a radio play, in a radio drama, the story follows different strategies. Among the important literary figures who influenced this change was Ibsen, Russian writer. He introduced in his play two interesting strategies, techniques. One was the flashback. That is, the story began in medias res and then went back to find important elements to understand it. And then the story didn't begin in the first part. Did not begin at the traditional start of the story, but began just before the most important moment, the climax. From science, for example, as you know, Einstein's theory of relativity, the fact that everything is relative, depends on the point of view, was a great influence. Another influence was the one of Bergson and Nietzsche, who were against positivistic attitude of life. So science does not control ourselves. And then arts were also another major influence. The works of the avant-gardes, Picasso, Kandinsky, and so on, they showed another possibility to tell a story. But modernism, most of all, was a revolt, a rebellion against the mediocrity of the middle classes. They were the predominant class in that period. There was an elite, a selected group of intellectuals who wanted more than just a standard, what was satisfying for the masses. Be careful when you say modernism or what is modern for the present condition. Actually, it was the opposite. They hated, the modernist artists hated all the new development of the industrial civilization. They wanted something more refined. And their rejection to what was standard, accepted by the masses, were, for example, a rejection of realism. They did not want to imitate reality, but they tried to experiment new ways. Some key ideas are, number one, it's like in Romanticism, because if everything is relative, then my experience is different from your experience. And there is also influence by science. There is a theory that is the so-called principle of undetermination in physics, according to which when we study atomic physics, nuclear physics, we cannot predict the behavior of an electron. So, in other words, we cannot know reality really. It's always behind our limits. Another one is that form, the way you tell stories, is more important than what you tell. In poems, instead of using, as in the poem, they used everyday language. And they could tell stories about everything. Most of the first English modernist writers were not from England, but there were Yeats and Joyce from Ireland, and Pound and Eliot were Americans. They moved to England, but originally they were not English. Apart some, basically, because they were an elite, they had very conservative ideas about society, about politics. So if you try to understand modernism, there are different ways that we can find some modernism. The first one is that the importance of impression, psychological impressions. You understand the world through the way you experience yourself, your individuality experiences the world. And what happens inside you is more important than what happens outside. Rationality, as it happened in the past, is not the guiding idea. The guiding idea is instead your personal experience. Another thing that characterizes modernism is the fact that instead of, as I told you before, duplicating, recreating what the social condition of life, they try to do something new, experiment, describe qualities of life. Let's talk about the novel, because we're going to concentrate on novels, not on poetry. They were influenced by some new ideas. First of all, the idea of time. There was a philosopher, a psychologist called William James, who tried to describe what happens in our mind when we think. And he said that when we think, it's like a stream of consciousness, a flow of thoughts, one after the other, without any punctuation, without any rule. You just have ideas, and then other ideas, maybe because of analogy, and it's like a river flowing without the idea of duration in English, of a philosopher called Henri Bergson. He said that duration, the experience of time, is subjective. For me, it can one moment, 1 minute can be like an eternity. For another person, can be a few seconds. So certain moments can last forever. Others can just pass by. So if time is subjective, why should we follow a chronological order from the beginning to the end? It's not important to know what happened before if you want to analyze just one single moment. And the thing is that we are not alone. If every one of us has a different experience, we will have different points of view. And this, for example, is what happens in some stories where there is a double, like in Virginia Woolf. When we read about the story, Mrs. Dalloway, there are two protagonists, and one is the double of the other, and each one has a different point of view, a different consciousness. Another important difference is this. In the past, there were novels that described the development of the protagonist from the beginning, when he was young, to when he became older. And so, 20 years, 40 years. But now, they believe that one moment can expand, can reveal the essence, the reality of things. You don't need to describe 20 years, just 1 hour in the life of a person can be everything. So instead of describing lengthwise during the years, they intensify the analysis of one single moment. Now, when we see, because of psychoanalysis, different forms of art that were influenced by psychoanalysis, it was very important to create new ideas through association. This is similar to another thing, use of symbols to express inner realities. And as we are complex beings, it doesn't mean, it's not necessary to be, it's not always true that we are coherent, logical. Sometimes we are a contradiction in ourselves. We say one thing and the other, and they both are truth. To recreate what happens in our mind, the punctuation, often forgotten, left aside. The influence of cinema, this new medium, creates the desire to move backwards and forwards at ease, without any problem. So instead of chronological order, the story moves back and forth as it happens in real life, when we think. How to recreate this stream of consciousness is a technique called interior monologue. So the stream of consciousness is what happens in our mind. The interior monologue is how a writer tries to represent what happens. There are different forms of interior monologue, and we see them in writers. So we will just skip this part. Basically, in some moments, we will see that just because the protagonist is just inside himself or herself. Mind is based on feelings, on intuitions. Sometimes a novel that is prose becomes a poem, a poetic novel. And those are the most intense moments of the stories, when there is an insight on the true themes of things. There are different famous writers, H. Lawrence, James Joyce, and Virginia Woolf. There are some that felt in a sense of isolation. Son of a miner, poor family, was not accepted by the other intellectuals, the other writers of his period, who were more elitistic, more refined. And Joyce had to leave Ireland because he did not feel accepted. That's it.